Eli.
Button here. Thank you. So I'm Eli Spivak. I will be chairing this meeting. Kat is out, and Chris is on the line from our officers group. And let's start off with an invitation. If anyone is in the audience who'd like to testify on one of our two topics for this meeting, please fill out one of our forms. Several are nicely filled out right now. If you do so, please put in your home address so that we can send you materials as this proceeds forward towards City Council. Let's start off with items of interest from commissioners. Seth.
Just to a note for the record that I am no longer a City of Portland employee and then can therefore vote, which I am looking forward to doing so today.
Great.
So I just wanted to let you know that I was at the climate strike. I don't know what climate strike, yes, on Friday. And it was really neat to see so many young people. And I just felt like, save us is what I was kind of thinking. Also on October 2nd, I'm going to be taking a webinar that's on accessory dwelling pilot projects that are set up to advance equity and affordability. And there'll be people from Silicon Valley, LA, Washington, D.C., and West Denver on it. If anybody is...
Can you hear us?
If anyone...
I wanted to say something after she spoke, so I was just having trouble muting and unmuting. Sorry.
Perfect. We'll loop you in. Awesome.
No worries. The webinar is on October 2nd. It's at 10:30. If anyone else is interested, let me know.
Thank you. Any other updates from the people in the room, and then we'll go to updates from those on the phone. All right, Akasha?
Hi, I would just like to invite everyone to the Business for a Better Portland Housing Forum on October 3rd. It is going to be, I'm not sure if everyone knows what Business for a Better Portland is, but it's a new kind of chamber of commerce where businesses are committed to championing some of the issues that are plaguing citizens of Portland today. And so we're hosting our housing forum on October 3rd. And I would like to invite fellow commissioners and everybody else in the room to participate and to come out.
Where is it? What time?
I'll tell you in 2 seconds. It is going to be at Red Fox Commons. That's 2034 Northwest 27th Avenue. It's going to be from 5:30 to 7:30.
Thank you. Chris, anything? Sorry, here, Akasha.
I was just going to add that Congressman Earl Blumenhout is going to be there, and several other, noted members of our Portland community. And so it'd be great if some of our commissioners could attend, as well as other people who are interested in, moving forward on our housing issue. That is all. Hello?
Chris, any comments from you? Or should we?
Nothing for me, thanks.
Thank you. All right. I was also at the climate march, took both kids out of school for it. A motivating activity. And let's switch over to Joe for an update. Director's report.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. I have 3 updates today. First, Better Housing by Design will have a hearing at City Council, so it's the next step in its review and adoption process on October 2nd. Second announcement, and we'll have more follow-up information on this, but we're going through an exercise of trying to think through how to redesign our budget advisory committee process to make it more a more in-depth sort of level of engagement with people who are involved rather than the way we've had to do it in the past. We're going to do an approach this year that starts off without the full re-engineering, but the first step would be to form a subcommittee from Planning and Sustainability Committee members and our Community Involvement Committee, plus the labor representatives who are usually on it. So there'll be more information coming, seeking a few, up to 3, I think, commissioners who would be willing to serve on that group. to review the Bureau's budget submittal for the coming year. And then finally, the DOZA project the draft is out. You have copies at your desk today. And the next two steps on that are to an October 8th briefing and an October 22nd hearing. And both of those are going to be a joint meeting with the Design Commission. So we're going to improvise and pack the room here for both of those meetings. That's it.
Thank you. We have two code updates in front of us today. One is on wayfinding, the other is on the extension of the tree code proposal for large trees through Title 11. Does anyone on the commission have any potential conflicts of interest with either of those code updates? And I'll note that these won't be actual conflicts of interest because the final decision making is made by City Council. But if there's something that you have a potential conflict, please share it now. All right, thank you. Then our first item is going to be Title 11, extending the sunset date. So I'll ask Emily Sandy to come on up from BDS, for an orientation. Thanks.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Emily Sandy. I'm with the Bureau of Development Services. And I am here to share the proposal to extend certain regulations that pertain to preservation of private trees in development situations that were originally passed in 2016. They had a sunset date of December 31st, 2019, and the proposal is to extend those same amendments an additional 2 years to December 31st, 2021. All right. Help, Julie. There we go. So I've got about a 10-minute presentation for you. I'm going to go over a quick summary of the proposal and some baselining information, tell you about how this legislative process works. Then I'm going to go back in time a little bit and give you the history of the amendments that were passed in 2016, go over what those amendments were, compare it to the previous code, and discuss a little bit what the PSC's recommendation was at that time and some of the issues they were grappling with at that time. Then quickly go over a little bit of data that we were able to capture about what has happened in the 3 years since, and then go over some further considerations that we would like to take a look at and are the reason for us requesting an extension at this time. So again, the proposal is to extend the sunset date for 2 years. I want to just baseline a couple of things for you. I want to clarify that what we're talking about tonight are private trees and development situations. So we're not talking about city trees, street trees, or trees in non-development situations. And you are probably all familiar, but just to recap, Title 11 makes a distinction between private trees, so those that are on private property, city trees, those are that are on city-owned or managed property, and street trees, those are in the public right-of-way. It also makes a distinction between trees that are in development situations and non-development situations. So development situations are situations where development is occurring and reviewed through a development permit. So new construction, additions, that sort of thing. I also want to clarify that this doesn't pertain to when tree preservation regulations are triggered, and it doesn't pertain to when a site or a tree is exempt from tree preservation regulations. So just to back up, the tree preservation regulations are triggered when there's ground disturbance in the root protection zone of at least one tree that's 12 inches or greater. Then there's a series of exemptions, and some of the more common ones are if your site is less than 5,000 square feet, if a particular tree is dead, dying, or dangerous, as determined by an arborist, and then in some of our more high-intensity industrial and commercial zones. So basically, when I say tree tonight, we're talking about, I just want to assume that we're talking about that the regulations have been triggered and there are no exemptions that apply. Let's skip ahead for a second. The process is for development regulated amendments to Title 11. The proposals are heard by both the PSC and the Urban Forestry Commission. So as you know, you're hearing this tonight. Urban Forestry Commission will hear this on October 17th, and then City Council is not yet scheduled, but tentatively for late November, early December. So going back in time a little while ago, Title 11 was adopted, I believe, in 2011, but it was not effective until January 1st, 2015. Less than a year after it was adopted or effective, there was widespread community concern regarding the removal of especially large-sized trees associated with development projects. Commissioner Fritz, who was the commissioner in charge of Portland Parks and Recreation at the time, requested fast-track amendments to Title 11 to address this issue. So PP&R and BDS at that time brought forth a couple of proposals, and we did get early input from the Tree Code Oversight Advisory Committee, the Urban Forestry Commission, Development Review Advisory Committee, and the city bureaus, but we were not able to conduct any other community engagement, which is one of the reasons there was a sunset date added to it, because it was kind of outside the normal scope of the process that we would have liked to have undertaken. Anyway, the amendments went through and they were effective May 2016. So, going backwards. Uh-oh. How do I go backwards? I'm going the slow way, I know. All right, so what were the amendments? The first is that the amendment continued to require that at least 1/3 of trees be preserved on site or pay a fee in lieu of preservation to the Tree Preservation and Planting Fund. However, it added a requirement that all trees 36 inches or larger be preserved or pay a fee in lieu of preservation. So before, it didn't matter what the size of the tree was. You could just pick whatever 1/3 you wanted. And what was added in is that all 36-inch trees had to be preserved or pay a fee in lieu. Also amended the structure of the fee in lieu. So prior to the amendment, it was a flat fee equal to the cost of replacing two 2-inch trees. And what happened after these amendments is they got divided into 3 tiers. So 12 to 20 inches is one tier, 20 to 36 inches is another tier, and then at 36 inches or larger, it goes up significantly, and it's based on an inch per inch fee at $450 per inch is the current rate. Just to note, the actual monetary amount is based on the per inch fee adopted by the Urban Forestry Fee Schedule annually, so it's subject to change from year to year. The other thing that was added was a notice requirement posted on site and mailed to neighborhood associations and district coalitions. At council, an exemption for certain affordable housing projects was added, and that they don't have to pay the fee in lieu of preservation for 36-inch trees, removing those trees. And then because of the fast-track nature of this, the lack of community engagement, kind of really we weren't able to do as much analysis as we would have liked at that time. There was a sunset date added of December 31st, 2019. Here is a comparison of the 2015 code. So prior to the amendments, I basically just summarized that. And then what the PSC recommended, and then what was adopted. The things in yellow I highlighted because they're different. So at the time, the PSC basically they didn't recommend going with the inch per inch mitigation fee until you got to 50 inches. And then there's an added tier in there for trees between 36 and 50 inches. There's a small change in the notification period. And then at the time, there was discussion about whether we were going to apply this rule to city and street trees as well. The PSC recommended that we do. That didn't get adopted. And then, of course, the affordable housing exemption, you didn't make any recommendation on it because that came up at City Council. This is a lot of words, but these are some excerpts from the PSC recommendation letter. So in item number 2, I'll just read a couple of sentences. Aside from the appointed committees and commissions, the comments from the general public supported stronger tree regulations. We also heard support for a subsequent, more comprehensive Title 11 update, among other issues related to Title 11. And then under item number 3, concerns were expressed about the seeming reliance on mitigation for tree removal and frustration that the current regulations do not ensure trees are actually preserved. However, there were also concerns about the impact of additional costs on development. Ultimately, the recommendation they felt continues to balance city goals for the urban forest and development while providing additional incentives to preserve trees. So what do we know that has happened since? This is a little bit of data that we were able to collect. So in the first table, you can see that there's actually been a decrease in the number of 36-inch trees removed and an increase in the number of 36-inch trees preserved. Going to the bottom, the fee in lieu of preservation revenue available is more than double. And that's based on basically the same number of permits per year, just to illustrate that the scale has remained relatively the same. However, these are the things that we don't know at this time, and are potential further considerations that we could look into. The table up here is something that we gathered back in 2015, and it's a very small data sample with 1 month, but it shows you the incidence of particular size trees on development permits that we saw. So you can see, like, from this data set, at least, when you get to 36 inches, the incidence of the number of sites it affects actually goes down. So that if we're talking about 36 and greater inch trees, we're talking about roughly 7% of the permits that we saw. Again, small sample size. We haven't analyzed who this impacts, negatively or positively, and from a variety of lenses. We don't know if it's effective at preserving larger sized trees, specifically when the tree is actually affected by the proposed development. It might be on site, but it might be away from the proposed development, so it's not really like anyone had to go through the exercise of choosing what to do. Does the notification process work? Are the thresholds correct? Do we need to pay more attention to those middle-sized trees? How does the affordable housing exemption fit in with other city regulations? What's the effect on housing development overall, not just affordable housing? And how do we balance sometimes competing priorities? Moving forward, I think that both BDS and urban forestry, and I forgot, I even had a note, Jen Kyra, the city forester, is here to help answer any questions too, are committed to working on this piece of the Title 11 amendment project over the next 2 years. There's a couple of different avenues of potentially a broader package moving forward, but that is in very, very early stages, and we don't even really have a sense of the scope right now. But so at a minimum, there's commitment to do this smaller project and potentially a larger one. So any questions?
Okay, not hearing any right now. For our commission, we've not done one of these legislative processes in a long time. So our next step, we'll get public testimony. Then we'll bring Emily back up and to answer questions that may get triggered by that or testimony we've read that was submitted previously. Then we'll have a chance to just deliberate, decide what we want to recommend, any changes, and then take a vote, and then discuss what we might want to include in a letter on this project. And this is a unique code project. We're a recommending body along with the Urban Forestry Commission. So we can both have separate letters, and we've discussed that we'll just get ours drafted, and then if they're in sync, then they would both go out at the same time, but they review this after us. So we'll switch over to testimony right now. Let's bring up Robert Bernstein first, and then Micah Mascal will come up next. Should we have two at a time? Is that okay? So we'll do 2 minutes each for testimony, and I'll give a little heads up when we have new people coming. So Robert, would you like to begin? Please start with saying your name.
But I'm on. Okay, that's
You're
fair.
on. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm Robert Bernstein, Southeast Portland resident for 50 years now. So when it comes to nature and trees, animals, fauna, I tend to hold the line. And I do this for a reason. Since we tend to monetize everything in our society, I'll let these quarters represent trees, and I'll speak about generations. So a generation grows up, and they have this much wild fauna around them, and that's their norm. Pressures come upon them, and they decide, well, okay, like in the name of balance, we'll compromise nature. Next generation comes along, this is the new norm. More pressures come along. Well, okay, so we'll compromise a third. Next generation comes along. After a couple more generations, you haven't sustained anything. It looks good, and maybe you've even used the word balance, which is often misused in these contexts. So anyway, I'm heartened by the number of trees that may have been saved due to the amendment, and I wish its extension, but I find some troubling inconsistencies that could be rectified. On one hand, the amendment dictates that I trust in the decades-away potential of a 2-inch diameter sapling planted as mitigation, yet at the same time it affixes no fee in lieu of preservation or minimal one for removal of a 35-inch tree. Even though the mature tree has huge real-time value, providing oxygen, stormwater management, carbon storage, summer cooling, habitat, noise buffering, improving mental health, mitigation can be a poor trade-off, especially if it omits the passage of time needed to fully recompense. Animals don't know from this passage of time thing. They need a place to nest, they need a place to breed. It doesn't do them any good to put something 30 years off into the future. At this point, with Mother Nature taking such a beating in so many ways, I'm not a fan of running a deficit for 30 years and calling it progress. To fix this, I propose that for trees 21 through 35 inches, that each inch over 20 would see the fee in lieu of preservation increase by $840.
So Robert, I'm going to ask you to wrap it up if you can, and submit that in
2
written
minutes.
testimony if you like. I guess I'm trusting. I've not done this before, but the red lights, does that indicate 2 minutes? I'm not running the timing.
Okay, I'm not sure my mic was on. Okay, so I would do away with all the exemptions, and I believe that all people, regardless of low income or affordable housing, should share in the benefits of trees and nature in general. And I'd also wish that the fees represent any increase due to inflation and any increased monitoring due to drought.
Thank you very much. And we can get the whole letter into testimony that you've prepared. Okay, Micah?
Commissioners, my name is Micah Mascal, representing Portland Audubon Society. Thanks for having us. Portland Audubon urges PSC to vote to extend the Big Tree Amendment, which helps mitigate some of the deficiencies of Title XI's protection. We all know the benefits of trees, and this is a step that you can take to ensure that more of those benefits are shared. But it's not the first step. And I think there are some steps you can take within this amendment itself to improve upon it. So it isn't just pushing forward the status quo and is taking the words and the attention that the climate strike brought of what the youth is asking for. We're not asking for status quo. So as we implore, as you pass this amendment, we implore that you consider other ways to build in green infrastructure and growing the urban tree canopy. One way within Title 11 is to remove the commercial and industrial zoning exemptions, both for this big tree amendment, but broadly. We feel that every part of the city should be playing its role in growing the urban tree canopy, in reducing temperatures, improving community health, and currently commercial and industrial zones overlay pretty closely with where our urban heat islands are. And those are often adjacent to communities and low-income communities. And so those places need to be playing a role and add to the tree canopy. We also look for PSC to consider reducing the lot size exemption from 5,000 to at least 4,000, which will bring in a significant additional amount to the city under Title 11 and the Big Tree Amendment. This is especially important as infill is upon us, and we are seeing more and more lots split from the more traditional 5,000 to less than that. And those places should have places for trees as well. So those communities can reap the benefits of cleaner air, of access to nature, and lower temperatures.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Next, we'll have up Katherine Michele. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. Thank you, Katherine. And Peter Salinger. And after that, it'll be Albert Kaufman and Doug Klotz. Katherine, thank you very much.
Thank you for your service. I really appreciate you doing this as volunteers. So I'm Katherine Michele, and I live in Southeast Portland, but I'm here to represent a newly formed group of seasoned tree stewards and advocates, Trees for Life. And our objective is to make Portlanders have a habit of tree care. So we know people love planting them, and we know there are lots of advocates like Audubon for habitat, but taking care of them has been a problem for people and a problem for the city. So that's our big goal, is to make tree care a habit. So in this case of this amendment, we really want you to extend the amendment and protect those 36-inch trees if possible, and if not, have people pay when they remove them. So we think that big trees are an equity issue because development is happening in East Portland more heavily than in any other place, maybe out toward Beaverton too, and there are lots of big firs out there, and we would like them preserved, and if not preserved, we would like them to be paid for. We also think that big trees are a health issue, and in that they're a big piece of green infrastructure. And the reason we think they're a health issue everyone knows about, but the easiest way to think about it is to think about a big tree is a whole building air conditioner. A small tree keeps your bicycle seat from getting hot. The difference is 10 degrees. It's huge. And so when we lose those trees, we're losing that benefit. So we know that the mitigation is an imperfect tool, but for us, it's hard to put a price on 50 years of stewardship or 100 years of stewardship. We can put a price on the tree. Everybody from Davy Tree and urban foresters around the world will be able to tell you what the ecological benefits of different species are. And you know, something like an elm tree has $190 some worth of benefits a year. That's very different than valuing the stewardship that went into preserving the kind of trees we're talking about.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to wrap up if you would.
And
Thank you.
so that's the piece that we want you to know that we are supporting, and we would like you to support the trees and the fund so that the trees are there for us to take care of.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Peter.
Hi, my name is Peter Salinger, and I'm here representing the Portland Youth Climate Council, which is a group that the city created in 2017 to advise the city on climate-related issues. In light of the recent climate strike, I would like to thank the Commission for stepping up to protect trees and thus protecting our climate. In an effort to make Portland a greener city, we must ensure that issues like this sunset clause are not forgotten or overlooked. We are slightly unclear on why the sunset clause is only being extended for 10 years, or for 2 years instead of indefinitely. Research can be done and altered mitigation requirements can be made without a 2-year sunset and without another fight to protect large trees 2 years into the future. That said, the 2 years of protection is better than no years of protection, so we are in support of the extension. Quickly, I would like to bring up something which Micah also mentioned, but that is the industrial and commercial zoning exemptions. Currently, trees are exempt from mitigation requirements in those zones, or rather, companies are exempt from mitigation requirements in those zones, and that's really not acceptable in the age of the climate crisis. We have to be taking all steps that we can take to protect against CO2 being released into the atmosphere. And so we hope that this commission and that the Urban Forestry Commission will take that into account. But I'd just like to wrap up by restating that we are in support of the extension, and we hope that in 2 years it won't come down to the wire and that we will have a more permanent solution that we can all be happy about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Albert Kaufman and Doug Klotz, and those are the last flyers I have. If there's anyone else who would like to testify, please bring your card up to Julie.
Okay. Hi, I'm Doug Klotz. I have a handout there. There are many reasons to save large trees, but the Planning Commission has to make those decisions of how to balance all these objectives that we're talking about. And one objective that we're trying to reach is carbon emission reduction. Okay, there's this map here, which I drew myself because the Berkeley Cool Climate site is really hard to read, the map. So I used their data and made a map. But basically it shows carbon emissions from transportation by zip code, per household. So if you can see that there's, the closer you are into downtown, the less transportation carbon emissions you're likely to generate in a household, and the further out, there's more carbon emissions. So here's how this would play out regarding trees. Suppose there's a parcel at 25th and Division in the RM2 zone with a large tree on it, and there's a proposal to build an apartment building there. The ordinance encourages saving that tree and building around it, which is fine. But what if the size of the building was reduced by, for instance, 10 units? And to do that, and those 10 would-be households instead moved to a building at 60th Division. So now each of these households is generating 3 tons more carbon per year. So that's another 30 tons of carbon to save this per year to save this tree. And the tree does sequester carbon, but the best I can figure, it's like 200 or 300 pounds, not 30 tons. I couldn't get exact figures on that, but that seems to be the right range. So these inner sites, especially along transit corridors, are the places where there's the least carbon generated for transportation, and with multifamily actually for building purposes too. So that needs to be balanced, and that's part of the reason why exempting commercial zones makes sense, because those are where we are allowed to get the densest apartment buildings.
I'm going to ask you to wrap up.
Okay.
Thank you.
So anyway, I'm glad to see the study is going to study these sort of things, and I would suggest that there be some mitigation in the zoning code. If you're saving a big tree, you get more FAR and more height, so you can build on one part of the lot and go higher. And also, as my last picture shows, you can put, let's get some big trees in the right of way.
Thank you. Okay. Albert?
Hey there. I'm Albert Kaufman, and I'm representing me, but I'm part of a group of tree activists called Old Trees PDX. And hopefully you've gotten a lot of testimony from folks in that group in the last couple of days. We care about trees. The group came together to try to stop the cutting down of the trees at 41st and Clinton, and some of the folks were also involved in the preserving the sequoias. I'd just like to talk about some of the things that are in the memorandum that I'm looking at here. I'm curious about trying to find ways to build more incentives in there to encourage developers to work around existing trees. This amendment, I don't think, really does that. I would encourage you to consider changing from a third of non-exempt trees to 2/3, possibly all. The whole concept of forcing developers to pay $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 to remove a tree is a joke. I mean, they get the money back from that fee by selling the wood of the tree, probably. So these numbers are just ridiculous. You mentioned you were at the climate march. I was at the climate march as well, and you said you thought about the youth and you want them to save us. Well, you are the ones who have the ability to set the rules of the game. This room is not filled with young people. This room is filled with you and us. And I'm 58. So at the moment, that's who's calling some of the shots is the older folks. So I would love to see this Title 11 just strengthened in huge ways. I'd love to see the fees increased. I'd like to know where the money from the fees goes, and possibly it should go to places like the Audubon Society to help them lobby for keeping bigger trees. And like Robert said earlier, I think the whole concept of allowing people to cut down trees now for some future benefit by planting other trees is just not ridiculous, but it's in that vein. And here's to impeaching the motherfucker.
Thank you for the testimony. Emily, would you please, is there any other testimony people would like to share? All right, Emily, are you available to come back up? What? Oh, that's right. Should that be testimony or part of our discussion? Okay, thank you. So Mike Halk serves on the commission, and he is not able to attend in person because he's traveling. But here are his thoughts he wanted to share. I've read all the written testimony, including the Urban Forestry Commission letter to PSC. I've also discussed the issue directly with Urban Forestry Commission members, and I'm pleased the UFC will be in attendance. I've long felt we need to have more input from UFC on matters related to the city's urban forest canopy, which is critical to protecting human health in the face of climate change and urban heat island impacts on humans and ecological health as well. Were I in attendance, I would be a proponent and yes vote for the Title 11 extension. I'm hopeful we as a commission will take the significant proactive role in addressing urban heat island and the nexus between protecting and expanding the cities and regions' urban forest canopy as one of our responses to climate change. This is clearly an instance where concerns over equity and resilience in the face of climate change, human and ecosystem, is a matter of sustainability. The PSC should be active in educating itself and the broader community about these issues and the need for proactive initiatives. Mike Halk. All right, Emily, would you like to join us, and with Katherine as well?
I'm inviting Jen.
Sorry, Kyra.
Up as well in case any questions or comments are more in urban forestry's purview.
All right, this is our chance to ask questions. Does anyone have some follow-ups? I do. Yeah, Katie?
Yeah, I have about 5. So one of the questions that came up for me is, what happens to trees if there isn't any kind of do homeowners have discretion on their trees if there's not going to be anything built there, or do they still have to pay if they want to cut down a tree, say for their view or.
So just in a non-development
Yeah,
situation.
non-development. Yeah.
I'll let Jen answer that question. Here.
I think this is on. Yeah. Thank you. Hello, committee. I'm Jen Kyra, the City Forester with Portland Parks and Recreation, and I will also thank you for your service to the city. I appreciate your volunteer time and energy. So the Title 11 Tree Code distinguishes, as Emily said earlier, between trees in development situations and non-development situations. In non-development situations on private property, like you're referring to,
Right.
that's an area that's regulated by urban forestry, and permits are required, and mitigation or tree planting as some form of replacement for removals for all trees on private property that are 12 inches diameter breast height, which is about as big as a dinner plate, or larger in most situations. There are details around that, but that's the upshot.
Okay, good. And then, I also was curious about what was happening to the tree money.
That's me too.
Yeah.
Title 11 defines a trust fund. It's called the Tree Planting and Preservation Fund. And that is where all mitigation payments, whether from development or non-development regulatory activities, are deposited. The code also defines how those may be used. They may be used to plant and establish trees for up to 5 years. That is, in effect, to try to replace some of the tree canopy that was lost by the removals that the mitigation payments were for. And that fund can also be used to acquire properties for tree protection and management purposes, or acquire rights to properties for protecting significant trees or stands of trees. That fund right now has about $3.2 million in it since its inception in January of 2015. That may seem like a lot of money, but when it comes to tree planting, that is what the Bureau of Environmental Services voluntary tree planting program spends in about 1.5 years in their tree planting. Those those trust funds must be reported on to council each year. We traditionally do that in the spring. The report this time was in May, and they're all on the Urban Forestry website, so you can see in detail what the revenue was, what the balances were at the time of reporting, how they were expended, and how we plan to expend them in the future. One thing I'll add, since that's a new fund, we undertook a 2-year study involving a lot of stakeholders, especially communities of color, immigrant and refugee communities, and with assistance from Portland State University to determine how best to use those funds, the city's funds. So that report is called Growing a More Equitable Forest. Okay. It is basically the city's tree planting strategy. It was presented to council also in May, and you'll find that information on our website.
Okay, thanks very much. I appreciate that so much. And I imagine that that you're taking climate change into account in terms of, like, I read one of the letters that came in, and they were saying that they were looking at the trees in the city of Portland and seeing a lot of stress in some of the big trees. And so, I was thinking maybe we're not always asking the right questions, and whether just the kind of the methods that we're using on the to preserve the big trees is that going to be enough? Are they going to be under so much stress from changes in temperatures that we're going to lose those trees anyway?
Good question. Yes, we are acutely aware and active with the climate emergency. We are seeing significant impacts on not just young new trees, which are more susceptible, but mature trees, including a lot of our native trees. In particular, western red cedars are heavily impacted right now. We've been seeing that for years. This is happening really quickly. Trees can't react quickly. We're doing everything we can in many, many ways to try to act on their behalf for the future. Forestry is always about looking 30, 50, 100 years ahead. I will say that the city's regulations around trees are really important when it comes to the climate realities that we're facing right now.
Thank you. And then my final question is really, it's kind of a question, but it's actually a request. I would like to see a map of where the tree code actually impacts the city. And I know it's it's not something you can produce today, but even if we've already voted on this, I would still like to see that map. So, because there's so many different exemptions, industrial lands and sizes of lots, and I don't, in my head, know necessarily where the lots are smaller than 5,000 square feet. So,
yeah, I think that that's producible. The only thing we wouldn't be able to capture is the individual trees that are exempt. They're dead, dying, and dangerous, but on a bigger
oh
scale,
no, I
that
don't
would,
need that.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
a
yeah.
little. That's a little more than I would.
But I think
need.
that on a bigger scale, that's.
Mm-hmm.
Additional questions? Ben?
I have one. It's regarding the industrial zoning exception. I think it's clear to me why the commercial zoning could be exempted. I think one testimony brought that up. I'd like to get a little bit more background from you, either one of you, in regards to the industrial exemption.
So, my understanding is that the industrial exemption, there's kind of two reasons for it. One is there is a heavy industrial zone, which allows for basically as much buildable area as a downtown lot and in the central commercial zone. So I believe IH basically allows 100% building coverage. So it's similar in the intensity and the physical intensity of it. And then general industrial is pretty similar as well. There is also some consideration, and I'm getting a little out of my area of expertise because this gets into BPS, but the impact on the buildable lands inventory for industrial lands and whether or not tree protection would reduce the amount of buildable land available for those uses. I don't think that that's actually been quantified at this point because I think the final adoptable buildable lands, I think, was adopted after Title 11 was adopted. So there may not be a specific analysis of that yet, but conceptually, that's one of the reasons.
Thank you. Steph?
Sure. And after this, maybe well, I'll let you handle the phone. I have a follow up to the commercial industrial because that, upon reading, was the subject of most of my questions. Because I'm if I understand correctly, all trees. I mean, the trees also have fee in lieu, and so how would that be impacted? Technically, those would be buildable. That there would have to be a fee assessed to them. Is that correct?
No.
Okay.
So if it's exempt, it's just exempt from all the regulations, preservation fee in lieu or otherwise. So.
But if those, I guess my question. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
But if they were not exempt, if they were removed from that exemption, they would still be buildable. They would just
have to pay the fee. They would have to pay the fee in lieu. But yes, you can. The way it's written right now, you can always build if you pay the fee in lieu of preservation.
Okay.
Yeah.
One more question.
Go for it.
And where is it? It's somewhere. Forgive me. If I understood your presentation correct me if I misunderstood. So I'm hearing that there were more fees collected in the past 3 years. Is that correct? Than previously? Or there were more. Could you talk about the fee and the number of trees preserved?
So what we did to get those numbers was we took our data of the number of trees preserved, and because as Jen mentioned, the fund comes from many sources. So we took our numbers of the trees that we had tallied that had paid a fee in lieu, and added that up based on the tree size. So we had an amount from 2015 based on a previous report that we did, and then we took the what we had collected in like the 2.87 years of data that we gathered earlier this year, and divided it by 2.87 to get an annual average, and so the annual average was. The annual average was about double of what it was in 2015.
Okay. Other questions from Akasha or Chris? Hearing none, I have a couple questions. One is are the exemptions in Title 33 or are they in Title 11?
11.
Okay. And we've been, at various times, we've been asked to look at reducing the exceptions. We did this as part of the residential infill project also. We ended up voting not to reduce it below 5,000, but it was mostly based on getting some analysis of the impacts. Do you see, so we've had sort of an appetite for looking at that, but it hasn't come to us yet. Do you see any kind of capacity to look at a code project that would involve that, and maybe some of the other items that people have? It seems like there's one very short phrase in front of us to recommend on tonight, and there's also a holistic request that I've heard of updating the, doing a big look at Title 11. Is there any capacity in the next year or two for that?
Well, as you may know, we Parks and BDS try to work together on these projects because, well, we share administration of Title 11 and we want to work together. I think from BDS's perspective, we're committed to working on this particular amendment and whether to adjust it slightly or make it permanent. You know, it's hard to draw the line because it's all related. I think I'm not going to say no, there's potential for us to participate either as reviewers, probably more as reviewers in a bigger project, if that comes our way and if that's requested of us. I think, Jen, you can answer for.
So we've had a couple requests to council to fund a one-time ad package to have staff capacity to work on amendments. As I'm sure you're aware in your role as committee members, that's a lot of work. What we're working on right now, those were unsuccessful. So what we're working on right now is finding other ways to fund that work. We have accumulated since January 2015 a rather large list from a variety of sources across the city of potential amendment items that need to be looked at and scoped, including some of the ones you've heard tonight, and have repeatedly and often heard requests for Title 11 amendments over the years. So we are trying actively right now to find a way to staff addressing those. So I hope to be back here sometime soon with things for you to contemplate.
Thank you. Any further questions before we go to deliberation? Yeah.
So we have 2 years, and so what kind of an analysis are you going to be doing in those 2 years?
I think one of the reasons we're asking for the extension is because we're not sure exactly what kind of analysis we're going to do. I think my last slide were some of the questions that we know we could be potentially be answering.
Mm-hmm.
But a project would have to be scoped, and we're just not at that point yet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Akash, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I did. So I wanted to know, I think I was trying to follow along on YouTube and look at the presentation, and you mentioned earlier about these barriers to, well, I guess that's the question. What were the barriers to doing the equity analysis and all of these other analyses that you said you guys didn't have a chance to get to, or it wasn't funded, or what was the barrier? Because I'm concerned that another 2 years that those problems wouldn't change. You would still have those same barriers.
The barrier is resources, and
what will change?
What's that? I'm sorry.
What will change?
What will change in 2 years?
So we have commitment from our management that we will spend time on this project over the next 2 years. This specific piece related to preservation of large trees in development situations. There's potential for us to be working on more, but that's what I can give you at this point.
I guess I just don't feel, I guess that answer just doesn't feel sufficient because you're asking for the same amount of time, and I don't know if council or who the authority is to give you those resources to make sure that those analyses are accurately done. I think that a lot of the testimony touches on what will happen if we continue to allow the removal of larger trees, you know, for added benefit that is not really one that we can say. I think it's a lot of the testimony spoke to that point, and I think the concern is that we keep making these allowances, and we're not really setting ourselves up for the future or for our present to create the future that we all intend to walk into or to provide for future generations or for ourselves as we age. And so I really want us to be able to. I'm not saying that you don't need the extension, but maybe you need even more time, or you need to ask for something else so that we can have those answers in the next 2 years.
I think that might be a good segue for us to have our deliberations, because part of what we'll discuss is the vote and also what we can include in a letter to City Council. So let's shift to that. In our process, we get to discuss now, and then if someone has an amendment or a recommendation to move the staff's proposal, then we can contemplate that or amendments to it. Any discussion? Flag me with a wave.
Do you want to have a discussion before we do the amendment, or?
I guess we can have I'd be open to a recommendation, a motion. That might be the best status, and then we can discuss it if we like after that. So would someone like to make a motion?
Sure, I'd like to make a motion. Maybe just a small preamble to that. I feel like we have some data. It's really not very comprehensive, and there is really a need to have a very serious look at this in the next 2 years and really use that time wisely. So maybe perhaps jumping ahead, I think we should really strongly, as in our letter, propose a strong project scoping. I think that's a really key item that we need to get out of this. So with that, I motion to approve the amendments as proposed and extend these this for another 2 years.
Okay, so we have a motion to extend for 2 years. Is there a second?
I will second it.
Thank you. Any discussion? If there's amendments, this will be the time to discuss that. Yeah.
So I think there are a few things here, and I want to first address the point that Akasha raised, which is that, you know, some of this analysis hasn't happened. We don't have all the data we need here, but I think that as part of our recommendation, we may want to encourage council to actually fully fund this work. It's not just an issue of scoping, but I know that many bureaus in the city are tasked with doing projects or programs through resolutions or other processes, and then not always given the resources that they need to do that. So I think that a strong scoping combined with sufficient resources and then a really strong attention to that equity analysis piece should be a part of our recommendation. I'd also like to put a couple of amendments on the table. I do think there's something compelling in the idea of removing the commercial and industrial zone exemption. That doesn't stop development from happening. It doesn't decrease the amount of housing we can put in those commercial zones where we need that much more density. But it does address the fact that trees are needed in those areas, and especially if we're building more housing in those areas, folks need that addressing of the heat island effect. And in particular, just speaking as someone who works in the Cully neighborhood, that industrial zone exemption is especially concerning because much of the Cully neighborhood is zoned industrial, and that impacts the folks in our community in a variety of different ways. So sending that strong signal that any development in the city should be mindful of trees regardless, I think is a powerful one. I'd also like to support reducing the lot size exemption. I'd actually go a little bit further than 4,000 down to 3,000. I think there's an opportunity to bring in sufficient funds to help with greening, and in particular in some of the work that's been done to address greening in impacted communities or frontline communities. I think additional funds can support that.
So we have.
Oh, so should I do separate? I guess those are separate amendments, not a single one.
Yeah, separate amendments.
Yeah. So I think the first motion would be to amend the recommendation such that we remove the commercial and industrial zone exemption.
Okay, is there a second for that?
I wholeheartedly second.
Yeah.
Okay. And I heard Akasha trying to jump in on there. Okay, so let's first have a discussion of that proposed amendment. Joe.
So this is not speaking for or against the amendment. I understand it. And actually, when we go back to when the commission deliberated it the last time, I think the concern on industrial was because we did not have an adopted economic opportunity analysis at the time, which is a state required study. So we have that now. That was adopted with the comprehensive plan. So one of the issues that was related to that has been met. The kind of thing also that I think caused the commission pause last time, but we haven't any analysis to show it one way or another, is at that time there was a concern about not knowing the facts about the additional costs of development in a commercial setting, because that's where a lot of the multi-mixed use housing was coming from, and this is 2015, so this is before inclusionary housing. They were struggling with that. We still don't have that analysis, but I'm not able to characterize it as important for that one way or the other. I just wanted to make sure everybody heard that.
I just, the one thing that would make me pause on that is that we should really do outreach to commercial industrial customers so that they know. I mean, I dislike changing the rules on people when they don't know about it. And so, yeah, for me, this would be difficult to do, even if I might support it at a later time.
Ben?
Along similar lines, I think I agree with that sentiment. I feel like we have a window the next 2 years that we can really fully utilize to scope this, fund it. I support that also. But I mean, there's several things that I'd like to tinker with. You know, the thresholds, are they really right? The fees, are they really right? There's so many things that we could really tinker and work with, but we don't really have the information we need. There hasn't been the outreach. I don't really feel like we got good data to really base our decision on. So starting to tinker with it doesn't feel right at this point. I do think that we need to have some strong commitment to just move forward and really address this. But that'll probably take, you know, the scoping and the funding that we need to have. So having a timeline of two years, hopefully less than that, seems like a reasonable approach.
Okay. Any other discussion?
This is Steph. I feel like I'm on the phone. This is Steph. This is me. I'm appreciative of. I understand. I appreciate your bringing up like not wanting to change the rules. I also feel that buildable lands is demonstrably near many communities of color. I think one of our largest manufactured dwelling parks is on buildable lands currently. I believe in Fox Run. Yep. And I feel that there is 2 years. This isn't forever. That this is 2 years, and if we've had 2 years with the exemption, and there has not been, while we're working on analysis, having a few years without exemption would let's use the sunset as a laboratory would be my suggestion. So thank you.
And I would share that appreciation for the concerns about that we don't have a lot of data. But I think that in particular, commercial and industrial folks tend to have access to these spaces in a way that the folks who are most impacted by development do not. And so I think that really taking into account the folks who don't have access to come and testify before the PSC or don't have knowledge about how this code may impact them in some ways, that we need to take that into account in our decision making as well. And that 2 years is not a long time if commercial and industrial folks feel like it is overly onerous or makes it more difficult to do development that is especially needed in the kind of mixed use, multifamily zoning spaces, then that's an opportunity to come and give us feedback. But I would encourage us to be more bold in our direction and really think about the fact that there is quite a bit of development that can happen in 2 years and quite a number of trees that could be removed that could have impact on those spaces and those communities.
I hear some comments on the line. Akasha or Chris?
Oh, I was just, agreeing strongly with the sentiments that have been expressed by both Ariana and Seth, that, what we've already seen is that the commission has given this organization 2 years to come up with results, and we understand that, yes, you're strained and resources are tight and limited, but we don't want to be back here in 2 years when ground can be broken in frontline communities and they have no resource, right? So again, I just echo what Oriana and Seth has said we need to act boldly. We need to, if our protest on Friday has taught us nothing, is that we are running out of time. And so we have to act now.
I'll share my thoughts on it. It would be very difficult for me to make a recommendation when we've heard no testimony for or against pretty much on this. We had a little bit of testimony from people suggesting that we exempt them. It's hard to make a decision without input. Part of what we do is get input from the public. And I feel like I would love to have this decision in front of me, and I, as Ben said, would likely be supportive of removing exemptions. And I just feel woefully uninformed about the implication in these areas. And so anyway, that's sort of where I'm at.
So I'll push back a little bit more against that, especially because we just had a history of planning that this commission has made many decisions without necessarily hearing from all of the folks who are impacted by that. And again, those are frontline communities, the folks that might be benefited from putting this exemption in. So I think let's take that into consideration, who historically has had more voice in front of this commission and who has not.
Are you confident the frontline communities will be supportive of removing the exemption?
I can certainly speak for my organization, Verde, that we would be, and that it would have a positive impact on the Cully neighborhood.
Okay.
So you should vote on the amendment.
Yeah. Chris is going to chime in for a moment.
I think it will be interesting to see how council would react to removing the commercial exemption without any significant public process. We are what many of us would call a climate emergency, so maybe there's a justification for that. Maybe one way to soften that a little bit would be to apply the same sunset to the removal of the commercial exemption that we're applying to the other portion, so that it can feel like something we're evaluating.
Mm-hmm. Is that an amendment proposal?
Ben made Ben proposed the motion to basically approve the extension, if I understand that correctly. Is there actually a motion on the floor to amend that?
Yes, there is, and it's been seconded. So the motion is to approve the 2-year extension, and then there's an additional motion to amend to remove the commercial and industrial exemption, and that has also been seconded. So that's what's for discussion now. So if you're proposing, so you could propose an amendment to that.
Or you could vote on this amendment and then come back at it with a clean amendment that has both parts in it. You have that choice. And it's just for being able to...
suggested would feel cleaner to me, so I'll just say that I'll oppose the amendment in its current form, but would be more amenable if it had the sunset provision in a different form.
So Eli, you need to vote on this amendment to make it clean.
Okay, thank you for the help. This is my first parliamentary facilitation.
This is just to be so everybody's clear on what you're voting on and what you're voting on next time. That's
Right.
the reason for this.
And I just like to add one more comment. It's like when it could be that the people that are going to build on this buildable lands would be employing frontline communities. Oftentimes, Columbia Corridor, for example, they employ a lot of middle income jobs, which are actually being gutted out of our economy. And so sometimes these things fit together a little bit differently than and that is why I'd like to have a little more time on that.
Okay, any further discussion before we vote on Oriana's proposed amendment?
I'd just like to hi, can you hear me,
Yes.
Eli?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, hello?
Yes?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I just wanted clarification on what Chris was proposing. Were you proposing that we take out the exclusion for commercial and industrial for 2 years, and when we have to revisit in 2 years, then we revisit that amendment to the amendment as well?
Yes, that's what I'm proposing.
Okay, but you.
Right. So, yeah.
I think for process, we should vote on what's on the floor right now, which is an amendment that would forever remove the exclusion for commercial industrial. If that does not pass, then Chris sounds like he's got an amendment that would remove that exclusion for 2 years. So with that, is that clear enough what we're voting on? Okay, so this is a proposal that would remove the commercial industrial amendment. Remove the commercial industrial exclusion, period. Would you like to call the vote?
Yes. Bortolazzo.
No.
Larcel. No. Lawrence Spence. And Chairman.
Can you hear? It's your time to vote. Akasha, are you on the line?
So it's like a text phone.
You vote by text.
Using all the technology. Yeah, all of our tools. Oh, they got hung up on.
Both of them?
Okay. I will continue with the roll for who's here. So Magnera.
Aye.
Routh.
Aye.
Spivak.
Nay. I can call Chris up right now. Chris, you're on a line just in time to cast a vote, and we'll try and get this. Try calling with this.
Yeah, the commission room fell off the conference. Kash and I were still on.
Understood. Our apologies. We're not sure why it happened.
Reinitiate it?
Yeah, Eli, you have to call back in to initiate the. But Chris can vote if you have him on the phone.
Well, you need to get Akasha as well.
Understood. I'm gonna.
Right. My vote is no.
Thank you.
Eli.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, Chris and Akasha. Can you hear me? Fantastic. I'm going to put you back on.
Okay, so we just need Akasha's vote for this.
Akasha, we are doing the roll call vote for the proposed amendment from Oriana.
Oh, yes, I vote yes.
Okay. Can someone help me with the tally? I get too distracted.
So it's 4-3 against.
Okay.
So it does not.
So the motion does not pass. Is there another amendment someone would like to propose?
Hey, I'm back.
I think this is
Chris, do you have an amendment you'd like to propose?
Did we get Akasha's vote? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Sorry, we did get the vote.
no, we're asking for your amendment.
Right. So I would propose that we eliminate the commercial exemption with the same sunset date as the proposed sunset extension.
And I would like to clarify, would you like to say commercial and industrial? That was the original one, or just commercial?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for the clarification.
Okay, so the proposed amendment is to remove the commercial and industrial exemption from Title 11 with a sunset date to match the sunset date in the original proposal. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Second from Ariana. Any discussion?
Isn't that the same motion?
No, this one has a sunset. I think the intent...
Well, the other one would have had a sunset anyway, right? Wouldn't it have?
It sunsets additional provisions. So this is in the spirit of what Steph was saying. It's like an experiment for 2 years. There's no exemption, and then it will sunset unless there's action.
But wouldn't the other one have sunsetted?
It would have sunsetted, but for those 2 years, there still would have been an exemption. Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't.
No, actually, I thought that for the original one, it would not have sunset. It would have just been part of Title 11. And it would have been separate because the sunset provision applies to the large trees. Title 11 applies much more broadly.
Oh, I didn't realize you were doing that. So we need to be clear, right?
So I think that the clear proposal right now, my understanding from Chris is that this would be, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, this would remove the exemption for commercial and industrial lands related to Title 11.
For all of Title 11?
Like, if I could...
For 2 years.
What we're talking about today is the large tree provision. And indeed, the exemptions that we're talking about that you presented are applicable to the large tree provision. Okay, so the action that you were being asked to do today is all around the large tree provision.
Okay.
I'm not really sure. I believe there is an exemption for industrial for all of Title 11.
For development situations.
For development situations, and all commercial are also exempted for all development
So
situations?
it's IH, IG1, EX, and CX that are exempt in development situations.
Across the board.
And yeah, so for private trees or city trees.
Okay. It's a major change, but that's just a different change than I thought you were proposing. But yeah.
Okay. All right, so we have a...
Right, so it's responsive. It's responsive to the testimony that we heard this evening and in writing.
Yeah, I was mistaken in thinking the testimony was about the large tree exemption. And so if you guys are now moving to change it all of Title 11. So in development situations, regulations will apply to trees.
Correct, for 2 years. And that will give a prompt for, if this passes, to dig in deeper between now and 2 years from now, I think.
I'd like to propose a friendly amendment to that and include in the amendment, or keep in the amendment, the industrial zones, but drop the commercial zones. The rationale being that industrial zones lots tend to be much wider. They have a lot more flexibility, a lot more land area in the city covered. So it could actually be more broad reaching. But one thing that I think was brought up in the testimony, and I think it's a good observation, is that in commercial zones, you have some of the higher densities that we want to encourage along corridors and nodes, etc. And there's although you may have situations where you have trees that you could preserve, that benefit may not be really offset by the fact that yes, you will be building less units, and then that those people would have to go somewhere else and move somewhere else, and not that carbon may or may not be upset. That's why I'm saying we don't really know enough about this. But it seems to me that it's a more clear point that we can make about the industrial zones rather than the commercial zones. So I'd like to have a quick discussion about that.
So I think it's just worth noting that the affordable housing exemption would still stand, so that we'd have more units of affordable housing. And we don't know the impact. You're right. But in 2 years, we can see if there's an impact on the number of units built. But I think it's worth remembering also that there are a lot of folks who will be living in these mixed-use zones who will be affected by a lack of trees and the potential heat island effect that comes with that. So just throwing that out there.
Could I ask staff which commercial zones are currently exempted?
Only one, CX. So I would like to clarify, there's a commercial zone, an employment zone, and 2 industrial zones. So if you're going to make a distinction between commercial and industrial, we need to know where that employment zone falls. So the zones are IH, IG1, those are the industrial zones, CX, which is central commercial, which is most of downtown and Gateway, EX, which is central employment. That's a lot of the Pearl. I mean, EX and CX function very similarly. So if you were going to choose where to put EX, I would put EX with the commercial and the 2 industrial zones together.
Okay. So commercial mixed use is not exempted right now, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so it applies in commercial mixed use zones, but currently there's an exception for CX, EX, IH, and IG1.
Yes.
Okay.
Eli, if I could just one more clarification, I just want to make sure everyone's clear on what you're voting on, and not arguing one way or the other about it. Other provisions, I think there's a whole suite of other provisions that apply to trees and development situations in addition to this. Like it's a big piece of code about how we deal with trees on a lot that's being developed. And Emily, if you could, I do not remember Title 11 that well, so I just want to make sure the breadth, the reach of the change that we're talking about here is understood.
It's actually not that big.
Okay, there you go.
It's basically what we covered tonight. So, how much? 1/3 of trees or pay the fee in lieu? What is the fee in lieu? Do you have to give notice or not? And then that's it. There are a couple different rules for city trees. But yeah.
Okay. So I guess Ben, that could be I think we should vote on the first one, the one in front of us right now, just like we did last time. And then if it doesn't pass, then you propose that one. Unless it's a friendly amendment. I guess that's a question for those.
And Ben, did you get a second on your amendment?
I didn't formally make it. It was just a friendly amendment. I guess we could probably ask Chris if he was the proponent.
Yeah, so I would decline the friendly amendment and clarify that my intent with the motion was to cover all the zones mentioned.
Great. Okay. Then I think we have a clear motion on the floor. Any more discussion on that motion? Okay, let's take a vote on the motion, which is to exempt for 2 years, to remove the exemption for 2 years on IH, IG1, CX, and EX.
Okay. Bortolazzo.
No.
Larcel.
No. And mainly just because I think.
Turn your mic on.
Mainly, I just think that people that are being affected by decisions should get some notice about it ahead of time.
Okay. Lawrence Spence.
Akasha, have you your chance to vote on this amendment?
Yeah, I'd vote yes.
Okay. Magnera.
Aye.
Rouse.
Aye.
Smith.
Yes.
Spivak.
Yes. Motion passes.
I hate to throw a wrench in something, but I need a clarification. Eli, at the beginning, I believe you said remove the exemption for large trees, which would mean only the rules that are applying to the, I guess, 36-inch and bigger trees, or did you mean to exempt for 2 years the tree preservation regulations as a whole?
I thought I said the second item, but it wasn't my amendment, so we should ask Chris.
Right. The intent was to remove the exemption for the zones listed from the rules for a period of 2 years.
And the rules being Title 11 rules?
For trees in development situation.
It would be tree preservation standards.
Thank you.
For trees in development situations.
Right. So the same preservation standards that apply in other zones would apply in the listed zones for the next 2 years.
Okay.
Okay. Was there any misunderstanding of the commission on that? Okay. I think we clarified. Thank you. Any additional amendment proposals?
That's it.
I heard one. Okay. Then would someone like to make a motion to approve the original proposal, which is a 2-year extension, and to include in it as amended, I'll just say.
And the motion is already on the floor, so we just need to vote on it.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm getting practice by fire here. So any discussion before we call a vote on the entire package?
I'd just like to relate it to Ben and Katie's issue. I guess one thing I just want to note that that I feel perhaps a little more bold in this, because we are not the final, we are advisory, and I would assume that there will be a conversation between now and then to get all sides. So, thank you.
Okay, let's call a vote.
Okay. Bortolazzo?
Yes.
Larcel? Yes. Lawrence Spence?
Yes.
Magnera?
Yes.
Routh?
Yes.
Smith?
Yes.
Spivak?
Yes. It passed unanimously. Thank you, staff. And I think let's take a couple minutes. We're way late. Someone tell me if I need to go faster on this, but just to capture what we might want to include in a letter to City Council. We've heard some comments already, but any additional thoughts? I'm going to toss one or two things in. One is, I know that we're dealing with tree in the private side, but our last letter to City Council implored the city to apply these same standards to trees in the public right-of-way. And I understand why that may have landed with a thud at City Council, because I'm not sure we can charge the city for removing trees in the right-of-way. But I would like to encourage the city to take some means to preserve trees in the right-of-way. And I'd say particularly in parts of the city that are not built out yet entirely, where they're unapproved streets, which tend to be some lower-income communities. There are a lot of trees that are located where future sidewalks, curbs, streets are going to go, and big trees that will be removed and will not be protected at all by these standards. So I'm not sure. So I guess I'd like to bring back what we included in our last letter, but a little more generally, to see if the city can encourage, provide incentives so that we don't remove trees in the right-of-way.
I like the idea. I think it's in the spirit of pushing a little bit further and having that discussion. I mean, I could see why it didn't go through last time, but
Okay.
I think it's a good conversation to be had.
I'll toss in one more, is that we got some good testimony in terms of how the things might be scoped. Roberta Jordan's letter had some specific suggestions on how staff could look at data to inform an update within 2 years. So I think supporting those kind of recommendations to look at the impacts of the tree code, positive or negative, will be helpful. Any more?
If I may, in the letter, I want to be responsive to Mr. Salinger's testimony, talking about the importance of, that this is currently sunsetting in 2 years, but that is, again, the laboratory and developing a deeper understanding so that we can move forward past that in a spirit of strength and boldness to move in response to the climate emergency. So thank you all for your testimony.
Yep. Thank you. And I hope that this can be drafted share it with the Urban Forestry Commission because they may not be expecting this package that we just recommended. Get in front of them. Thank you. Next up, we have Zeph and Andrew to present on the Columbia Lombard wayfinding improvements. Can you join us? Who would like to start?
I'll start. My name is Zeph Wagner. I'm a transportation planner at PBOT. I want to thank you for having us today to talk about this wayfinding project, and I'll let my colleague introduce himself.
Good evening. I'm Andrew Abbey, Capital Project Manager with the Portland Bureau of Transportation, joining Zeph today. Thank you.
So we wanted to come to you today with a proposal to rename some segments of certain streets in the Columbia Corridor area. And this really emerged as a way to improve wayfinding a couple years ago when I worked on the scoping and the grant writing for the Columbia Lombard Mobility Corridor Plan. This was it's ODOT TGM, Transportation Growth Management funded planning process that has been funded and is in process right now, a more traditional planning process for transportation projects, capital improvement projects. But while writing that grant, I sort of struggled with what to call what I thought was Lombard Street. And I discovered that a lot of the segments that I thought of as Lombard had different names, that it changes names several times along the corridor. And so in my outreach to community groups and to the Portland Freight Committee and other groups and business groups, in my conversations with them about the mobility corridor plan, I started asking them whether they saw this as a problem, the confusing street names in the area. And just overwhelmingly, people really felt like it was one of those things that had always been a thorny issue that the city had never done something about, that would be really great to fix. And so we decided, rather than folding it into that longer planning process, to sort of spin it off as a separate process. Because it seems like a common sense thing to do, and we've managed to secure a very small amount of funding from our freight program, which is dedicated to things like this, small striping improvements and wayfinding improvements for this effort. So I'll just walk you through the issues. So this is a map of the Columbia Corridor that we're talking about, and really focusing on what people generally refer to as Columbia Boulevard and Lombard Street. And from the Rivergate area all the way to I-205. And just a few things to highlight here before I walk through each segment. You'll see that Lombard changes to Burgard and then back to Lombard, and then becomes Portland Highway, and then becomes Killingsworth. And that's all while driving in a straight line, more or less. And the segment up near Rivergate ends up being 3 streets intersecting at a single point. And so you can start to see why, just at a macro level, people start to get confused about where they are, and often will say they're on the wrong street and might have trouble getting around intuitively. So I'll walk through the corridor sort of from west to east. This is the intersection of Lombard, Burgard, and Columbia. You'll see the street sign there pointing in opposite directions. But essentially, if somebody's driving on Columbia Boulevard straight, it just becomes Lombard. And then a little bit past that, about a mile away, Burgard turns back into Lombard at a seemingly arbitrary point. It's basically at a bridge that crosses the railroad. And that's right by Northwest Container Services and Terminal 4. And as far as what I can tell, it's a sort of a historical anomaly because this used to be the border between City of Portland and Multnomah County. And that's the reason for a lot of these name changes. So when the City of Portland ended here, that's where Lombard ended.
Yeah, and by the way, full disclosure, that last slide that Zeph showed you, I actually got lost there once myself. So I've had some personal experience with wayfinding in this issue. Going back to slide number 4, thank you, Zeph. One of the adjunct things that we're finding out on this project is when you're talking freight areas, you're talking very large parcels. And heard from a property owner earlier this week that they have this huge parcel. Somebody was in cardiac distress earlier this month, and they just had simply one address, one dot on this very large parcel. So we, in a parallel effort, are going to be working with that property owner to try to assign interior street names to the private streets that are on this large parcel. And we'll be reaching out to some other large businesses, strictly voluntary. Again, we're talking interior streets that are private, but we do want to take advantage of this opportunity to help wayfind within the very large freight parcels that you see in this area. Thank you.
Yep. Going back a little bit, I'll also mention what the proposed renaming is. And so in this case, our proposal as it stands would be to rename Lombard, where it is from this intersection up to Marine Drive at Kelly Point Park, would become Columbia Boulevard. So that if somebody's driving on Columbia Boulevard for miles and miles, they would continue on Columbia Boulevard past this intersection up to Kelly Point Park Road, which is where it swings around and becomes Marine Drive. And then Burgard here would be renamed Lombard so that it's not changing. We did outreach with the Port of Portland and Northwest Container Services in this area, who are really the main property owners here, and they both supported the proposal because they've never understood why it was like this.
Could you just bring up that bigger picture map and then just point out, is this the way it is now? And
this is how it is now. And
okay, so how would that change?
Yeah, I'll show
We have a slide towards the end that'll kind of tie it all together.
Yeah, but essentially that farthest blue section in the upper left corner would become Columbia Boulevard.
Okay.
So that
becomes orange.
So that really you have Marine Drive and Columbia Boulevard, and they only come together at Kelly Point Park. And then that small piece that's Burgard would be Lombard. And so Lombard would start at that intersection and then continue all the way east. And we were curious whether there was another Burgard Road or Burgard named road in case anybody's attached to that historical figure. I'm not sure who that is, but there is a North Burgard Way nearby, kind of a side road. And so that would be retained for historical posterity. So continue walking through. I thought this was amusing that even Google is confused about where the streets start and end. This shows it shifting at Time Oil Road, but that's not really where it shifts officially. It's at the bridge a little farther south. So this gives a sense of, even if you're using wayfinding apps, they might not be getting it right, and it may cause a lot of confusion when it tells you to stay on a road to go to a different road. That can make people think they should have made a turn when they didn't. Moving along, this is an interesting issue we encountered on Columbia Boulevard. This came up when I took the rest of the proposal to the St. John's Neighborhood Association about 4 or 5 months ago. And they really urged me to add this because several people lived on a small local street, essentially, that's sort of a frontage road to Columbia Boulevard, but it feels completely different. It feels like a local street with small houses. This is what it looks like, and it's up on a berm above the main arterial. So you have a small residential street up the hill and behind a lot of trees from the 5-lane arterial, and they're both officially called North Columbia Boulevard. It's not even officially called a frontage road. So people's houses on this street, their address is North Columbia Boulevard. And they've said that a lot of times when people are delivering things to them, when people are trying to find them, they're having to give complicated instructions on the phone because people are driving up and down the big arterial street looking for their house. And you can only access this street from one point, from one signalized intersection. It's not even open, connected at both ends. So,
and I should also add, when we put up the new street signs, we will not need to remove any of those trees that you saw in that last photo.
Yeah, to relate it to the last one. Yeah, we should find a way to relate this to climate. Hopefully people will not get so confused driving around and can reduce a little bit of vehicle miles traveled with this change. So here's the proposal for this, is that we would rename this section North Johnswood Drive. You can see it up there on the upper left. There is a short street called North Johnswood Drive that runs straight into this. And so I think that would give people that feeling of, it would communicate instantly that it's a local street. Johnswood sounds like a local street. It's not going to be confused with Columbia. And it does have those trees along it. So that's kind of just a nice name for that. And we sent letters to people along here and generally supported it. Back to sort of the major streets, this is one that really trips people up. This is probably the most confusing one, is that Lombard suddenly becomes Northeast Portland Highway when it passes underneath the 42nd Avenue Bridge. So this isn't even at an intersection. It just sort of magically shifts. And then it's only Northeast Portland Highway for about a mile. So it's a pretty short segment. And as much as we can tell, this was also the boundary of the city of Portland. So this was 42nd Avenue is the boundary between Cully and Concordia, and that was also the boundary of the city of Portland until the 1980s when the Cully area was annexed. And so my guess is that Lombard was the existing name in the city of Portland. Portland Highway was the Multnomah County road, and it was just never changed when we annexed it. And we've had cases where there's news reports about traffic crashes here that have said Lombard, and then they later had to correct it to Portland Highway. And also the name Portland Highway doesn't evoke a lot because there's a Portland Road in another area of town. It's a little generic, and it also has highway in the name. And I think even though this part is technically a state highway, I think in my outreach, a lot of people would prefer it kind of had that Lombard name that connects it to the rest of the city in a clear way. Another section that's come up is this odd transition between Killingsworth Street. So Killingsworth used to just go straight through east-west, and at some point when this was built as a highway, as Highway 30 bypass, and widened, this sort of T intersection was created. And this is really the transition from the major 5-lane arterial to a much quieter 2- and 3-lane street that goes through the Cully area right by the upcoming Las Adelitas affordable housing development that Hacienda CDC is working on. And this can cause a lot of confusion too. I've heard people call this Cully Boulevard. I've heard them call Portland Highway Lombard here. And the fact that you're just continuing straight, again, you want it to keep the same name ideally when you're turning straight. They're also very different in character. So I did do some outreach last year with Verde and talked to a few people there, and they really agreed with this notion that Killingsworth they see as sort of the more neighborhood scale street and want it to be calmer, and we support that, and we're working on various projects to try to calm that street, versus the section on the east side here with the 5-lane arterial section is an ODOT highway. It's owned by ODOT, it's operated by them. It's a very different character. It's much more about long distance through traffic versus this quieter sort of local access neighborhood traffic street. So there's some value to just signaling to people that the two streets are very different in character and would sort of help them differentiate them. So our proposal on this one is Northeast Portland Highway would become Lombard, and Killingsworth Street east of this intersection would also become Lombard, although it'll be part of a phase 2, which we'll get into later. As we went through here, we also noticed some issues around this area around Columbia Parkway, which was the East End Connector project that PBOT did at least 10 years ago now. And essentially what happened is the old Columbia Boulevard was sort of retired a little bit as the major through street, and Columbia Parkway was built as a major multi-lane, grade separated from the railroad undercrossing. And this was really designed to get all those freight vehicles, those trucks moving goods from the Columbia corridor underneath that railroad track and to the I-205 interchange to reach Market, get where they're going. And at the time, this was the decision to name it Columbia Parkway. But we see this as a problem because it's really confusing to keep the old name Columbia Boulevard for what's a pretty minor sort of more of an industrial access street that's not meant for the through traffic, while calling Columbia Parkway a different name than the street that people are trying to get to. This is a photo of what it looks like. So this is a very nice, grade separated street. This is where we really want people to go if they're accessing Columbia Boulevard to go farther west. Here's a great example of how kind of confusing this can be from a wayfinding perspective. So when you go on Street View in Google, it's saying Columbia Boulevard where it actually is, but our signage says Columbia Boulevard for the lane that goes on to Columbia Parkway. And that makes sense because we want people to use that street to get to Columbia Boulevard. But, if somebody's following their app or following a map, they could easily use this other one, which then leads them to a pretty small, less improved roadway that has an at-grade railroad crossing here.
Can I do a quick time check? I know that we're
pretty
running
close to
late.
the end, yeah.
Okay. And
we're
are there commissioners who might need to leave so we can still have quorum? All right.
We'll
Thank
zip
you very
through.
much.
And by the way, we also have a sign that's a little off frame here in this photo that says 292nd Drive. So there's kind of 3 different street names floating around here. And so our proposal for this one would be to actually make that little one-way ramp essentially Northeast 92nd Drive, because that's really where most people are going if they use that on the right-hand side there. We would call the sort of minor, more local freight access street Northeast Columbia Court, which we typically use for streets like that are not the through streets, kind of gives the right signal to people. And then rename Columbia Parkway as Columbia Boulevard to really tell people that's where they're going for long distance. One thing we ran into with the Killingsworth segment is just that there is a high cost to changing the freeway signage. There's a lot of traffic control involved, closing down lanes, replacing the signs. And ODOT's current rules say that local jurisdictions pay that cost if we choose to change names. So we don't have the funding at this time for that cost. And we also would like some time to work with ODOT to see if there's any potential for cost sharing and things like that. So what we're essentially asking you today is to approve the entire package, including this Killingsworth change, as a recommendation to City Council. But there would be, when we go to City Council for Phase 1, we would only be changing everything other than that section so that we could come back later without having to go back to you, essentially. We did a lot of outreach to the property owners. We sent a survey to everything except for the Johnswood one because that was a late change in January. We only got about a 15% response rate. That's not too surprising because I think a lot of people just see this as a pretty small change in the grand scheme of things. And I usually find that the most passionate people do send responses. So I see that as a good thing. Of those who responded, generally there was a lot of support for most of the proposals, kind of in that 47 to 71% range of the people who responded. We also sent out a separate survey to the 14 property owners on the Columbia Boulevard frontage road. Only 2 people responded, 1 positive, 1 negative. But again, I think people who really dislike proposals usually come out in force, in my experience. So I do find that encouraging that I think a lot of people didn't feel like this was a major burden or a major change for them. I also went to these groups and talked to them, sometimes multiple times. A lot of them, again, felt like this was such a common sense sort of proposal that they didn't end up sending in testimony. They didn't feel like it was necessary, but in conversations with them, they generally supported the proposal. And we do have a couple people here to testify as well. So this is what it all looks like wrapped up. To answer your question, you kind of have a lot more long, continuous, single road names, much more intuitive for people. This isn't sort of a, something that gets people super jazzed up, I would say. It's more, we see it as more of a technical fix, trying to solve some of the things that never got fixed before when the annexations happened. But I can't tell you what a positive response I've gotten when I've gone to these groups. A lot of them have really thanked me for even paying attention to this, because sometimes it's the little things that matter, and people feel like sometimes we focus so much on big transformational changes that we forget about some of these just everyday annoyances and issues that people run into. Maybe
So those were the project goals that it's been a long evening, so I'm not going to read all these individually. You can read them on your own. Just a timing check on this. So South Portland becomes effective May 1st, 2020, and this will be a year behind it, May 1st, 2021. This is a much, much smaller scale. So South Portland is changing on the order of 10,000 addresses. There's only about 100 addresses that change here, and only 2 of them actually get a new address number. So it's just a very small project relative to South Portland addressing.
So thank you very much. And for the history, we voted not that long ago to create Portland's 6th quadrant.
Sextant.
Yeah, sextant, right. So thank you very much. And let's get some testimony. We have Pia Welch and Corky Collier. Do 2 minutes each. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay. Evening. In the interest of time, I'll make this very short. My name is Pia Welch. I work for FedEx Express out by the airport. I'm the logistical planner for the Oregon and Southwest Washington area. I'm also the chair of the Portland Freight Committee. Just so you know, I've reviewed this with our truck dispatcher and truck manager, and they are very thankful for this proposal and the work that's been done on it. It'll help alleviate especially a lot of confusion up in the Lombard Street area where there's 3 companies that share the same address, and it's hard, especially for new drivers, to properly navigate this area. We've also reviewed this at the Portland Freight Committee, and business owners and people who work in this area are for it. This will streamline things, make things a little bit easier, avoid some awkward maneuvering. There's some areas where trucks end up on railroad tracks accidentally because it's confusing. So again, I would like to thank everyone for the work on this, and to thank ODOT for their generosity in wanting to pay for half of the sign. And hopefully we can move forward on this. If you have any questions, feel free to get a hold of me. If you want a tour of a FedEx facility and the industrial lands, I'm here for you.
Thank you.
My name is Corky Collier. I'm Executive Director of the Columbia Corridor Association. As Zeph mentioned, this project started off when he got confused with the street names. Why is it changing names when I'm on the same road? It was kind of silly. What's impressive is that he took on this task willingly. Nobody put this on him and said, here's a problem, go solve it. He observed the problem and he came up with a solution. And for that, I want to thank Zeph for the solution, but also for just being a good public employee. It's also worth noting that this effort led to fixing some other problems. For example, one of our members, Everaz Oregon Steel, realized as we reached out to him on this that their entrance on the Portland emergency database was wrong. It was a closed entrance. So if an ambulance had come out, fire truck, they would have gone to a closed entrance. That could have been catastrophic. We're now in the process of fixing that, getting those ambulances to the right entrance, thanks to Andrew Abbey. So we appreciate that as well. This proposal covers a very big area. It expands pretty much exactly half of the whole Columbia Corridor. But despite that, we've had very, very few complaints about it. And we've reached out to a number of people, inquired. The biggest complaint is the concern of the cost of changing addresses. And that's something I don't want to push off to the side. That's a very real concern anytime the city starts to make a decision that causes an individual an additional cost. Hopefully we can come up with some better solutions to that, but at least we've given them a good time frame for those fixes. But from a cartographic perspective, from a geographic perspective, this really makes sense. From a historical perspective, I talked to a number of people, said, why do we have these names right now? And they said, we haven't a clue. So it looks like the new names, the name change, is more historically accurate than the current names. So everything is lining up very nicely. The biggest hiccup, as Zeph mentioned, is the problem with Killingsworth as we near 205. And that's a good lesson in unintended consequences. As the city changed a lot of street names, ODOT finally said, you know what, we need a policy that says if you're going to change the street name, you got to pay for the highway signs. And this project, which is entirely name changes for wayfinding purposes, got caught up in that. Hopefully, we'll come up with some funding on the PBOT side to match ODOT's offer of paying for half of those changes. So everybody's working together on that. Hopefully, that'll happen. I
We'll
encourage
wrap
your
up if we
support.
can. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Any other testimony? All right, staff, would you like to come back up if we have some questions from the commission? Any questions from us? From people on the line? Steph? Of course.
I have one niggling question, and it relates to the sextant. So, and just because next year is the census, we're sure that, like, renaming the streets on May 1st, 2020 during a census year is not going to futz with the census.
Correct.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. I thought you were going to ask for a septant. Create a new one up there.
I had one question: is how long the existing street signs would overlap with new ones? Yeah, and I think you mentioned that there may be a chance to advocate that they don't overlap for as long as code currently calls for.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question. So one of our current code calls for a 5-year dual street naming. And I talked a little bit about this at the officers briefing, and this is really a Title 17 issue that doesn't really fall under the purview of the PSC, but nevertheless, I just kind of want to let you know where I think we're headed on this. So a couple of things. One is our maintenance folks hate the 5-year dual street renaming thing because people go out and steal the old signs for 5 years after the old ones are up, and then, they have a lot of needs around the city, and then here they are, they're putting up obsolete street signs for 5 years. They'd much rather be striping a street for Vision Zero and saving lives or doing that as opposed to just putting up more street signs for thieves to steal. So
maybe I should jump to a quick answer would be great.
Yeah, and then the second piece of this is U.S. Postal Service. So they only forward mail for a year. So we've had just some initial internal discussions at PBOT, but I suspect where we will land on this is when we take this package to council. We will also look at a code change to shorten that dual signage period from 5 years, from down to 1 year for local streets, 2 years for arterials, and then that code requirement, if we make that change, would apply to Columbia Lombard. So,
okay,
short answer, 2 years maximum.
Any other questions? All right, would someone like to make a motion?
Sure, I'd like to motion to approve the Columbia Lombard wayfinding improvements as proposed.
And I'll second.
You have a second? Any discussion? Let's call a vote.
Yes.
Larcel? Yes. Lawrence Spence?
Yes.
Magnera?
Yes.
Routh?
Yes.
Smith?
Yes.
Spivak?
Yes. Thank you. Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you.
We've gone many months without doing a legislative process. Now we've done 2 of them in 1 meeting. Thank you. The meeting is adjourned.
That one pretty quick. Yeah.
Boy, it's hard.